Our Bible word is Mark 5, verses 30 to 32. And Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that power had gone out of him, turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" But his disciples said to him, "You see the multitude thronging you, and you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see her who had done this thing. So this is the well-known incident where Jesus healed this woman with this bleeding condition. Of course, we find also parallel accounts in Luke 8 and Matthew 9. So it's part of the triple tradition of the Synoptic Gospels. Of course, Synoptic Gospels means those Gospels that are seen together. That's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But our portion of Mark chapter 5, or from 4 actually, it's from 4:35 to 5:43. That is where Jesus defeats the forces of evil, because he calms the sea. That Gerasene demoniac, that's where he heals someone from demonic possession. And of course, he also heals physical illness, that's our woman. And he also conquers death by the raising of Jairus' daughter. So those various little pericopes, one after the other, that explains how Jesus defeated the forces of evil. And I want to bring attention to those last three areas, because that's a typical feature in Mark that's called sandwiching. Mark does this more than once. He begins a story and then he interrupts it with something else, but then he goes back to the original narrative and he finishes that. Yeah, we can see, for example, that's request for healing by Jairus, and that's in verses 21 to 24. And then later on from verses 35 to 43, that's where Jesus actually raises Jairus' daughter. But this now we come to what we might call the meat in the sandwich, and that's the woman with hemorrhage. And those things, they mutually inform one another, because those two narratives, although there's a sandwich effect, what it highlights is the importance of faith. When faith combines with Jesus, wonderful things happen, wonderful things come into being. For example, the raising of Jairus' daughter, it's Jesus tells the man, just believe. And also, as we will see in this incident where Jesus heals this woman with this flow of blood, also the importance of faith comes about. So just take note when you read Mark's Gospel of this thing called sandwiching, especially these two interrelated stories where the importance of faith is highlighted. So here's this woman. The evangelist explains she had this problem for 12 years already, that she had seen many doctors. She spent all her money on the doctors to help her, and nothing has helped. And of course, for this woman to have this condition, she was in a perpetual state of ritual impurity. It was a harsh thing to be in the first century Jewish context. Because if you look at impurity, understand it as a form of disorder. Disorder is anything that's the blurring of the boundaries, or anything that might be perceived to undermine God's order of creation. Committing sin brings you to a state of disorder or impurity. If there's a blurring of the boundaries, or something's out of place, for example, you have a skin condition, that's a blurring of the boundaries. Or death, that's the most severe form of impurity or disorder that there is. But this woman, she's also in a severe state of impurity or disorder. She's not in a state of well-being or wholeness, or according to God's perfect order of creation as it was understood. Normally, if a woman had a time of the month, she would be regarded for 7 days as ritually unclean. Later on, it was also added 7 other days, and even today, Jewish women then would go into a mikveh to like perform this final act of purification. For anybody where there was this flow of blood that was chronic, that continued for days or whatever, or for years, as in the case of this woman, it was a more severe state of impurity, and it actually required a sacrifice to be brought to the temple. So if the bleeding has stopped for some other reason, then she must bring a sacrifice of 2 pigeons or turtle doves or whatever it may be. And then the priest would perform the necessary sacrifice, and then he would declare this person or this woman as clean or pure. In other words, that state of disorder is now vanished. It specifically said it's a sacrifice of atonement. The priest will make atonement for her. So I would say go to Leviticus 15, verses 25 to 33. And there it's also explained what happens to the sacrifice that must be done for this woman. It's a sacrifice of atonement that she must make at the end of it. So it's was a severe or harsh form of impurity. So this woman, obviously, with her condition, with all the doctors, all the money she spent and whatever not helping, she obviously must have heard about Jesus. And she must have now been convinced that if I touch this man or whatever, he'll be able to help me. If we go to verse 27, it says there, when she heard about Jesus, she came behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, if only I may touch his clothes, I shall be made well. So consider this in its context. She's not supposed to be in public. Of course, if she touches anybody, she will render the other people ritually impure. I mean, if she's on a bed or sat in a chair and somebody else would go sit on it, they would be rendered impure. But here she is. She's not supposed to be in public. She's not supposed to touch anybody else. But yeah, we can imagine she's forcing her way through the crowd. Because it says people thronged around Jesus. So she must be forcing her way through the crowd, touching other people. In that moment, she doesn't care about that as much. She just wants to get to Jesus. So what if I make other people impure? This man can heal me, and I'm going to go there and I'm going to touch his cloak or his clothes, and that will heal me. And that's what she does. The social taboo that surrounds this poor woman would have been isolated. Nobody can touch her or what she touched. She goes out in public, and she doesn't care about that. She says, I'm going to touch Jesus. That shows a faith, a conviction in Jesus also. So it says in verse 29, immediately the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of the affliction. So she could felt it. Her body has been restored. And now we come to our Bible word. And Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that power had gone out of him, turned around in the crowd and said, who touched my clothes? But his disciples said to him, you see the multitude thronging you, and you say, who touched me? And he looked around to see her who had done this thing. So Jesus recognized when this woman touched him that power had gone out of him. Now, there's also an important thing here because many people thronged around Jesus. Many people touched Jesus. But this one woman who touched him, he said power had gone out of him. Just this one woman, not the many that came to him and thronged him around him and touched him. This one woman who touched him, Jesus then felt power had gone out of him. It shows you the faith of this woman, her conviction in coming to Jesus. It was different to the other people who came to Jesus. I mean, he is a famous guy, he's done healings, he's maybe a prophet, whatever, but this woman had faith in Jesus, the right sort of faith where special things happen. Of course, now Jesus turns around, he says, who touched me? And the disciples, of course, said, what do you mean? There's all these people around you. Everybody's touching you. But there was one woman who touched Jesus, and then he says, who touched me? So there's also a special lesson in terms of for us to learn here in terms of the faith. Now the evangelist then explains is that with fear and trembling she came forward and she confessed the whole truth. What's the whole truth? It's her conviction that coming up to Jesus and just by touching his clothes, it's kind of like magic. And there's also faith there that she would be healed. Then Jesus of course addresses her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction. So Jesus, this power has gone out of him, and he's happy with that because God's power is active in him. And God's power worked through Jesus because of that woman's faith. According to this narrative, even without Jesus knowing who touched him. But God's power was active in him, and Jesus recognized and acknowledged, yes, this is what God has done here. I'm with it. I'm on board. I approve of this. This has come about by this woman's faith. So Jesus told her, daughter, your faith has made you well. So let's go back to that sandwich I mentioned earlier. It's that where Jairus requests Jesus for a healing, and it comes about later on when Jesus raises Jairus' daughter. But yeah, the meat in the sandwich is where Jesus heals this woman with hemorrhage. And those two stories combine to emphasize the importance of faith. And again, let's go back to verse 34. Daughter, your faith has made you well. So remember these two stories here in Mark. It emphasizes the importance of faith. Faith plus Jesus coming together works miracles. It's where God's power is revealed. And then Jesus also tells her, go in peace and be healed of your affliction. So Jesus confirms, go in peace. In other words, she can be restored back to the community. She's not this untouchable anymore that people must avoid and whatever she sits on. Now she's restored to the community. She can take on the role again as a woman, maybe as a mother, as a wife, whatever it may be, she was in the community. That's the peace that Jesus restored to her. But also, he says, be healed of your affliction. So Jesus affirms you have been healed. And yet Jesus also in a sense acts as a priest. It was only priests in the temple that could declare people that you are now pure. But Jesus says, yeah, be healed. So in Jesus, yeah, he takes over the role of the temple and the priests because he affirms this woman has been healed. She's now back in a state of purity. But more than that, she's now in this relationship with Jesus, the Son of God, who even brings a greater form of salvation than just healing. So we have here in Mark 4-5, this where Jesus defeats these forces of evil. I mean, he conquers the natural elements, the water, the sea. He conquers demons. He conquers physical illness. He conquers death. He conquers evil forces. And especially now, our episode here that forms part of that sandwich where Jesus raises somebody from the dead and heals this woman with hemorrhage from her disease. It also emphasizes the importance of faith. Also interesting, if you want, according to the church historian Eusebius, he wrote in the early 300s that at his time, probably around 325 AD, that's a story that this woman actually came from Caesarea Philippi, and even in his day at a house, there's this little monument, this little statue that was built, a bronze statue of Jesus reaching out his hands to this woman who was holding his hands up to him, asking for help. And it commemorates this woman who was healed by him, this woman with hemorrhage. And that even in that day, it was believed to have these magical healing properties that even pagans of the time went to get healed. So if you want to read more about that, it's in Eusebius Church History, chapter 17.18.1-4. So it's something very interesting to read. So yeah, we have a sandwich in Mark's Gospel where faith is emphasized, and especially this woman with hemorrhage, her remarkable bravery, her conviction, even though she's taboo and shunned, she goes to Jesus. She forces her way through the crowd, so to speak. She doesn't care in terms of her state of ritual impurity because she wants to touch Jesus and be healed by him. And that's what she obtained.